The day my mother-in-law threw me out of my own house, she was wearing my late mother's pearl earrings, standing in my kitchen, holding a suitcase she had already packed for me. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because it tells you everything you need to know about the kind of woman Diane was. She had gone through my jewelry box, taken something that belonged to my mother, who had passed away 3 years earlier, put it on like it was hers to wear, and then had the nerve to tell me I no longer belonged in the house I had paid for. My name is Claire. I was 34 years old, and that morning was the moment I realized my mother-in-law had spent the last 5 years treating me like a guest in my own life, and I had simply let her because I loved my husband enough to keep the peace. That morning was also the last day I ever let her get away with it. Let me back up, because you need to understand how we got to that kitchen on that particular Thursday with a packed suitcase sitting on the counter like an eviction notice. I met my husband Ryan when I was 26. He was kind, funny, hardworking, everything I thought I wanted, and for the most part, he still was those things throughout our marriage. The problem was never really Ryan. The problem was his mother, Diane, who from the very first dinner I had with their family made it clear that in her eyes, no woman would ever be good enough for her only son. Diane was the kind of mother-in-law who complimented you in ways that were actually insults. She'd say things like, "It's so brave of you to wear that color," or, "I'm surprised Ryan likes cooking like this, but I suppose it's nice you're trying." She corrected the way I loaded the dishwasher in my own home. She rearranged my furniture when she visited, claiming she was just helping, and got genuinely offended when I moved things back after she left. She called Ryan every single day, sometimes twice, and expected him to answer immediately, regardless of what we were doing. For years, I told myself this was normal mother-in-law behavior, the kind every daughter-in-law complains about at girls' nights, nothing more serious than mild, manageable friction. I told myself that as long as Ryan and I had our own life together, Diane's opinions didn't actually matter. What I didn't realize, what I was too naive or too in love to see clearly, was that Diane wasn't just overbearing. She was building, slowly and patiently, towards something much bigger, and I was too busy keeping the peace to notice the foundation she was laying. The house is where this story really starts to matter, so let me tell you about the house. 4 years into our marriage, my grandmother passed away and left me a modest inheritance, more money than Ryan and I had ever had access to at once. We had been renting a cramped 2-bedroom apartment, dreaming about buying a home someday in the distant, unspecified future, the way most young couples do. Suddenly, with my grandmother's inheritance as a down payment, someday became now. I want to be very clear about this part, because it matters enormously for everything that happened later. The down payment came almost entirely from my inheritance. Ryan contributed some savings, but the overwhelming majority of the funds that allowed us to buy that house came from my side, from my grandmother, a woman who had worked as a school teacher for 40 years and saved every spare dollar so that her family might have something better one day. When we found the house, a beautiful 3-bedroom craftsman with a wraparound porch that I fell in love with the second I saw it, I insisted, at the advice of my father, who had some financial background, that my name be on the deed alongside Ryan's, given how much of the purchase came from money that was legally and unquestionably mine. Ryan didn't object. Why would he? It was fair, and he knew it was fair. We signed the paperwork together, both of our names listed as co-owners, and we moved in 3 weeks later, giddy and exhausted and completely in love with our first real home. I never mentioned this deed detail to Diane, not because I was hiding anything sinister, but because it genuinely never came up in casual conversation. And honestly, I didn't think it was any of her business how Ryan and I had structured the ownership of our own house. That single, unremarkable decision to just not bring it up ended up being the thing that saved me later, though I had no way of knowing that at the time. Diane, for her part, treated our new house the way she treated everything else in our lives, like it was an extension of her own domain. She had a key, which in hindsight was a mistake we should never have agreed to, and she used it liberally, letting herself in whenever she pleased, sometimes while I was still in my pajamas on a Saturday morning, sometimes while I was in the shower, always with some excuse about dropping something off or picking something up. Things escalated significantly about 2 years ago when Ryan's father passed away suddenly from a heart attack. Diane, understandably devastated, leaned heavily on Ryan for support, which I completely understood and never once resented. What I didn't expect was that her grief would slowly transform into something that looked a lot like entitlement over our lives, and eventually, over our house itself. About 8 months after her husband's death, Diane suggested, almost casually at first, that maybe it made sense for her to sell her own house, which was large and empty and full of painful memories, and move in with us just temporarily until she got back on her feet. Ryan, who has always struggled to say no to his mother, agreed before he even discussed it properly with me. I remember feeling blindsided, but I also felt like a monster for objecting to a grieving widow needing support from her family. So I swallowed my concerns and agreed to what I was told would be a short-term arrangement. Temporary turned into indefinite almost immediately. Diane sold her house within 2 months and moved into our guest room with what felt like an entire moving truck of belongings, most of which ended up scattered throughout our shared living spaces, because apparently her decorative preferences simply had to take priority over the home I had spent years making my own. The next year and a half was, without exaggeration, one of the most difficult periods of my life, and not because of grief or financial hardship, but because I was slowly, steadily being erased from my own home by a woman who had never once, not for a single day, treated me like I belonged there. Diane took over the kitchen, rearranging cabinets to her liking, criticizing my cooking in front of guests, replacing my carefully chosen decor with items from her old house that she insisted looked more appropriate. She started referring to the house as Ryan's house in conversation, always leaving my name out entirely, as though I were simply a resident rather than an owner. She began inviting her own friends over for gatherings without asking me, treating our living room like her personal social hall. She criticized my parenting when our daughter Lily was born, second-guessing every decision I made about feeding schedules and bedtimes, always in that same falsely sweet tone that made it impossible to call out directly without looking unreasonable. And Ryan, my sweet conflict-avoidant husband, did what he always did when it came to his mother. Nothing. He'd occasionally offer a half-hearted, "Mom, maybe don't do that." But he never once stood firm, never once made her understand that this was our house, our marriage, our family, and that her presence in it was a privilege, not a right. I brought it up with him repeatedly, in private, in tears sometimes, and he always promised he'd talk to her, and he never really did, not in any way that produced actual change. I want to be honest with you about something. I started resenting Ryan almost as much as I resented Diane during that period, because his silence felt like its own kind of betrayal. Every time he failed to defend me, every time he let his mother's comments slide instead of correcting her, it chipped away at something between us that I'm not sure ever fully recovered, even after everything that happened later. The breaking point, the moment everything finally erupted into the confrontation that changed my entire life, happened on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday morning in early autumn. Ryan had left for a 3-day work trip the night before, an unavoidable business conference 2 states away. I remember feeling a small guilty sense of relief when his car pulled out of the driveway, because it meant 3 days of slightly less tension in the house, even with Diane still there. I was in the kitchen making breakfast for Lily, who was 2 years old at the time, when Diane walked in already dressed, already put together, wearing an expression I'd never quite seen on her before, something colder and more determined than her usual passive-aggressive sweetness. "Claire," she said, "we need to talk." I remember feeling a small knot form in my stomach, the kind you get when you sense a conversation is about to go somewhere unpleasant, though I had absolutely no idea how unpleasant it was about to become. "I've been thinking a lot since Robert passed," she continued, referring to her late husband, "about family, about what really matters. And I think it's time we had an honest conversation about this house and about your place in Ryan's life." "My place in Ryan's life," I repeated slowly. "Diane, I'm his wife." "For now," she said, and I want you to sit with the coldness of that phrase, because it set the tone for everything that followed. "Look, Claire, I've watched you these past few years, and I don't think you and Ryan are truly compatible. I think you've made him unhappy, honestly, more often than you've made him happy, and I think it might be time you consider moving out, giving him some space to figure out what he actually wants." I stood there, genuinely stunned, holding a spatula, trying to process what my mother-in-law was actually saying to me in my own kitchen. "Diane, I'm not going anywhere. This is my house. I live here with my husband and my daughter." "It's Ryan's house," she said, her voice sharpening. "You know that, right? Ryan's father and I helped him get established long before you came along, and frankly, I think it's time you understood that some things in this family exist independent of whatever marriage happens to be happening at a given moment. I've already spoken to a lawyer friend of mine about tenant rights, actually, since you don't seem to have any formal ownership claim here, and I want to be clear, I'd rather this be amicable, but I am prepared to have you removed if necessary." I actually laughed, a short disbelieving laugh, because the absurdity of the moment hadn't fully hit me yet. "You spoke to a lawyer about removing me from my own home?" "From Ryan's home," she corrected again, and then, with a kind of triumphant cruelty I will never forget, she gestured toward the counter where a suitcase sat, already packed, presumably with some of my own belongings that she had gone through and selected herself. "I packed some of your things. I think it would be best if you and Lily stayed somewhere else for a while, until Ryan gets back and we can sort out the details properly, as a family. I've already called my nephew. He's got a truck. He can help you move whatever else you need this afternoon. I want you to understand something about this moment, because it's the hinge on which this entire story turns. Diane genuinely believed, with complete and total confidence, that she had the authority to evict me from a house she had no legal claim to whatsoever. A house she didn't own a single percentage of. A house that existed because of my grandmother's life savings and my own name on a legal deed that Diane had apparently never bothered to check. She was so confident, in fact, that she had already opened my jewelry box that morning, presumably while packing my things, and helped herself to my late mother's pearl earrings, which she was now wearing casually, as though they were simply available for her to claim along with everything else in the house she believed belonged exclusively to her son. I set the spatula down very slowly and looked at her, and something inside me shifted from shock into an ice-cold clarity I don't think I'd ever fully accessed before in my entire adult life. "Diane," I said, my voice completely steady, "take those earrings off right now." She blinked, clearly not expecting pushback on that particular detail amidst the larger conversation. "They were just sitting in a box," I thought. "They belonged to my mother, who is dead," I said. "You do not get to wear them. Take them off." Something in my tone must have registered, because she reached up and removed them, setting them on the counter with a slightly embarrassed expression, though the cold determination in her eyes hadn't fully faded. "Now," I continued, "let's talk about this house, since you seem to have some confusion about it. You said you spoke to a lawyer about my tenant rights. I'd love for you to explain to me what tenant rights you think apply here, because I am not a tenant, Diane. I am a co-owner of this house. My name has been on the deed since the day Ryan and I purchased it, alongside his. In fact, if we're being precise about the actual numbers, the down payment on this house came almost entirely from an inheritance my grandmother left me. You are more than welcome to check the county records yourself if you don't believe me, but I promise you, you will find my name right there, in black and white, next to Ryan's, on legal paperwork that has existed for years. I watched the color drain slowly from her face as the reality of what I was saying began to sink in. That's not... Ryan never mentioned... Why would he mention it? I said. It's not exactly a topic that comes up at Thanksgiving dinner, but Diane, I need you to hear me very clearly right now. You do not own this house. You do not have the authority to remove me from it. And frankly, the fact that you packed a suitcase for me, went through my personal belongings, and stole my deceased mother's jewelry, all before consulting a single legal document or even asking your own son whether his wife had ownership rights, tells me everything I need to know about how you actually see me and how you've seen me for the past 5 years. Diane's face had shifted from cold confidence to something closer to panic, though she tried, admirably, to maintain some shred of authority. Claire, I think we're both a little emotional right now. Let's just wait until Ryan gets home and we can discuss this like adults. No, I said, and the word came out with more finality than I think either of us expected. We're not waiting for Ryan to get home, so you can spin this into some story where I'm the unreasonable one. I want you to pack your own things, Diane. Today. I want you out of this house by tonight. You can't just throw me out, she said, her voice rising with genuine alarm now. I can, actually, I said. You're a guest here. You've been a guest here for 1.5 years, a guest who has overstayed her welcome so thoroughly that she apparently forgot she was ever a guest to begin with. This is my house, legally, on paper, whether you like that fact or not, and I am well within my rights to ask a guest to leave. I called Ryan that afternoon, and I told him, calmly but firmly, exactly what had happened. To his credit, and honestly, it was one of the only moments in this entire ordeal where he actually stepped up the way a husband should, he was appalled. He cut his work trip short and flew home a day early, and when he walked through the door and found his mother still there, tearfully attempting to negotiate her continued residence with me, he did something I had been waiting years for him to do. He told his mother, in no uncertain terms, that she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, that stealing from his deceased mother-in-law's jewelry box and attempting to illegally evict his wife from her own home was not a misunderstanding to be smoothed over, but a genuine betrayal of trust that he could not simply excuse because she was grieving. He told her she needed to find her own place to live, effective immediately, and that while he would always love her as his mother, she was no longer welcome to live under our roof after what she had done. Diane cried. She apologized eventually, though I've never been entirely convinced her apology came from genuine remorse, rather than the sudden realization that her plan had catastrophically backfired. She moved out within 2 weeks, into a small apartment across town, funded partially by the sale proceeds from her old house that she had never fully spent. Things between Ryan and me were strained for a while after that, understandably. It took months of honest, difficult conversations, and yes, some couples counseling, for us to fully repair the damage that 1.5 years of his passive silence had done to our marriage. But something fundamental did shift in him after that day. He started actually setting boundaries with his mother, real ones, not just empty promises. He started defending our marriage, our home, our family, instead of quietly hoping conflicts would resolve themselves if he just avoided them long enough. Diane and I have what I would describe as a civil, distant relationship now. She sees Lily on occasional weekends, always with clear boundaries in place, always with an understanding that this house, this family, this life belongs to Ryan and me, not to her. She's never again brought up the topic of the deed, though I suspect she's never quite forgotten the moment she realized, in the middle of a kitchen she thought she controlled, that the woman she'd spent years trying to erase actually had more legal claim to that house than she had ever bothered to consider. I think about that morning often, not with anger anymore, but with a strange kind of gratitude, because it forced a confrontation that had been building for years, one that Ryan and I had both been too conflict avoidant to have on our own. Diane's cruelty that day, going through my things, stealing my mother's earrings, packing a suitcase like she had every right in the world to remove me from my own life, ended up being the exact catalyst needed to finally establish, once and for all, whose house this actually was, and whose marriage it actually was, too. If there's one thing I want anyone listening to this to take away, it's this. Protect your name on the paperwork that matters. Always. No matter how uncomfortable that conversation might feel in the moment. Because you never know when someone in your life will try to convince you, and everyone else around you, that you don't actually belong in the home, the marriage, or the life you helped build. Diane spent 5 years trying to make me feel like a guest in my own house. All it took was one legal document, quietly signed years earlier, to remind her exactly whose name was written in permanent ink and whose never was.